titanium and steel. If anyone, except our government, showed you a smoking hole in the ground minus an airplane and were told that an airplane crashed there, would you believe it? Rational people seem to understand that there should be an airplane at an airplane crash site. However, there were 2 airplane crash sites minus the airplanes on September 11, 2001. They hope you do not compare the small amount of heat damage at the Pentagon to the heat damage that caused 3 steel frame skyscrapers to collapse perfectly, symmetrically and totally. They hope you do not see the video of Building 7 that collapsed into a tiny pile of rubble at free fall speed and compare that collapse to another video of a controlled demolition.
Here we are, smack dab, right in the middle of Silverstein Properties. In the next few minutes, we're going to talk about Mr. Silverstein and go over the history of the World Trade Center complex and some very serious questions that need to be answered. You know, it's interesting to note that Larry Silverstein bought this building many, many years ago. This was the only building he bought in the complex. But 2 months before 9/11, he bought the entire complex, all 7 buildings, and took out a record insurance policy on them for over $3 billion, which he's now been paid. In fact, he tried to get even more. He wanted $7 billion on an original $200 million investment that they made on the entire complex when he leased the whole structure. Mr. Silverstein did quite nicely in his investment. Also, Mr. Silverstein, quote, with a shadowy group of investors, according to the Chicago Tribune, just bought the Sears Tower, one of the next big targets the government's been saying. We hope and pray that nothing ever bad happens, and that's why we're here exposing who may have motives in not stopping further events. The command center for Rudolph Giuliani was in this building. Rudolph Giuliani had his command bunker in this structure, and so did the CIA. It wasn't just the city of New York. The CIA, the FBI were all based in this building. And Rudolph Giuliani told ABC News that he got a call that morning about 8 hours before this collapse, before a fire even started, and was told, get out of Building 7. And he left to a FEMA command base that had already been set up the night before, which he's now admitted in congressional testimony, right down the street by the harbor. A lot of interesting timing.
And since 9/11, Giuliani's gone into the terror fighting business, and he's made hundreds of millions of dollars with Giuliani and Associates. Interesting.
And then, of course, we have George Bush's youngest brother, Marvin Bush, running security on the complex. And, of course, his contract, by the way, ended on the morning of 9/11. So that's another interesting facet to all of this. None of it adds up. But guess who ran security on these buildings? Marvin Bush, brother of the president, son of the former president, or the former CIA director. Marvin Bush ran security for this whole complex. This whole complex. And guess when his 2-year contract ended? This is the Associated Press on September 11th.
And where did the media pick up on this story? From Barbara Bush's own memoir, Reflections. She wrote about it in the book.
Then you have the firefighters telling Associated Press reporters to get back, to get away from the building, that Building 7 was about to come down. And then it magically did come down. And then the University of New York and the U.S. Geological Survey, federal and state, both seismographs picked up explosions going off, the classical pattern of a controlled demolition. He said that they made the decision on the afternoon of 9/11 to go ahead and pull or demolish Building 7, and that they gave the order and watched the building go down.
Building 7 is further away from the towers and was not hit by planes. It's further away from the towers than buildings right across the street like the Millennium Hilton and others. So if your building's owned by Larry Silverstein, it collapses because he's got a big fat insurance policy. But if your building's closer and owned by somebody else, it doesn't get damaged at all.
Why is the story of Building 7 so important? Why don't we spend so much time on it? Because the official story is that the 2 planes that hit Tower 1 and 2, the big 110-story buildings, caused them to collapse, even though a modern steel building had never collapsed from fire. But then we have Building 7 that was further away than any of the buildings in the complex that later in the afternoon got a few small fires in it and collapsed. Now they have almost rebuilt Building 7 on the exact same spot. And look, buildings right next to it, even though it collapsed on fire, didn't even get that much damage. And then we have this huge building that was right beside Tower 1 and 2 that was hit by giant chunks of the building that did catch on fire, but nothing collapsed. The difference between that building And the new Building 7 is that Larry Silverstein doesn't own that building. Larry Silverstein doesn't own the Millennium Hilton that was closer than Building 7. But every building he owned either caught on fire or mysteriously collapsed.
Is it not safe to assume that all four of these events are inescapably married to one another? And is it not also safe to assume that if you find one person involved or a party involved with one of these events, they're probably involved in all of them? Well, following this train of thought, since there was no credible claim of responsibility, is it not safe to assume that those involved or those parties involved or agencies or groups that were involved in the events of 9/11 would do anything that they can to obfuscate, distract, or distort or cover up any information that might lead to their discovery? And if that's true, is it not also safe to assume that if you find somebody, a group, an agency, a party that is involved in the obfuscation, distraction, distortion, or cover-up of any information involved in any of the events of 9/11, does it not indicate possible involvement and even guilt in the events of 9/11?
But if, let's be dogged here, if the official story is true, and an astoundingly successful sneak attack from diabolical Muslims caught America totally off guard, then the White House surely must be highly motivated to turn heaven and earth, to use one of their own favorite cliches, to investigate the events of that day as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The White House must rush to appoint a respected chairman and commissioners, give them the widest powers to call witnesses, spare no expense. Except for the Reichstag fire, that's how it's usually done. 6 days after the sinking of the Titanic, a chairman is appointed to head an investigation. 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the first of 4 investigative commissions is struck. The JFK assassination, the Challenger disaster, 7 days each. How many days after 9/11 is it that President Bush names someone to head an investigation?
This commission has been charged with a crucial task.
After a universal backlash, Kissinger backs off. Bush then names, it's 431 days now, Thomas Kean and Lee Hamilton as co-chairmen. Kean's Azerbaijan oil connections and other conflicts of interest should make him ineligible from the outset. He earlier co-chairs the Homeland Security Project. Observers have noted that huge profits are to be made in the surveillance and security industries these days. The more alarmed the public, the bigger the profits. As for co-chair Lee Hamilton, Washington investigative journalist Joyce Lynn says he should be called Mr. Cover-Up. He is 0 for 4, she says, in finding any malfeasance in the 4 previous investigative commissions on which he served. These include the Iran-Contra affair and the October surprise, which denied Jimmy Carter the presidency. The White House chooses all the commissioners. Lynn calls them key insiders rife with conflicts of interest. The White House brazenly appoints as the executive director one Dr. Philip Zelikow, a right-wing Republican hawk deeply involved in the Bush circle, a member of the Bush-Cheney transition team, and a National Security Council advisor with Condoleezza Rice under Bush 1. The editor of Vanity Fair, Graydon Carter, sums it up. The Bush White House did everything in its power to derail an open inquiry. Then, when faced with its inevitability, the President and his aides sought to limit its scope, its access, and its funding. The Commission's full title is the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States. Reflecting extreme laziness in research and wording, the mainstream media keep referring to it as the Independent 9/11 Commission. This commission was about as independent from White House control and manipulation as the abused prisoners at Abu Ghraib were from their jailers. Mandate. The commission itself says, we're not out to blame anyone. In other words, accountability is not part of the mandate. Budget. In January 2003, the Bush administration allots the commission $3 million. This compares to $5 million for a 1996 commission that looked into casino gambling, and $50 million each for the inquiries into the Columbia shuttle explosion and the Clintons' failed Whitewater deal. The dollar amount is later grudgingly raised but never exceeds $15 million. The White House releases only 25% of 11,000 documents requested.